Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 6, Halacha 1. This is part 2 of this year. We're going to be finishing it up. And today we're going to be getting into the idea of, is an Aris going to be a vineyard? That's really where we're going with this. Now, the Mishnah has a dispute with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Tanna Kama. And really what the debate is like this. The sages are saying that the novelty of the Aris is that it is a vineyard, and that is going to be the halacha. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying that the Aris is not a vineyard. And not only is it not a vineyard, it has a special halacha that makes it so you can't plant anything within 4 amos. Now you say, wait a second, but a vineyard has it where you can't plant anything within 4 amos. Well, that's what we learned. If we have a halachic vineyard, you can't plant anything within 4 amos of it. Individual vines, you plant within 6 tefachim. A tefach, by the way, is a handbreadth. Now, in looking at the novelty of this, if Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying that this is not a vineyard, but the novelty is that you cannot plant within 4 amos of these vines. And you say, oh, wait a second. So it's very close to maybe being a vineyard, right? But Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says it's not a vineyard. The only novelty is that you can't plant within the 4 amos of this. Again, the Aris is going to be like a bed where you're taking the vines of the tree of the grape and you're hanging it onto a wall and a trellis. And this is what is going to be an Aris. Now, there's a maloket that ended off in the end of chapter 6, halacha 1, part 1 of the shir between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, where they were saying that they're in talking about the Aris between what the sages are saying. They're saying that is the Aris going to be a crooked Aris where it's not shaped in a linear fashion where the vines are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a row? And that was the debate. Rabbi Yochanan said that the Aris that they're talking about is in a row. The Aris, by the way, that the sages are talking about. And that Rish Lakish was saying that the Aris can be still a crooked Aris. In other words, he was saying that the novelty can be that the vines can zigzag. Now, we're going to get into really a 3-way debate because there's 3 opinions. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri has 2 other major Tanaim that are going to be agreeing with him. In fact, one of them is going to be Rabbi Yossi. And we know the halacha normally goes by Rabbi Yossi, except when the Tanna Kama is going to rule against him. And this is going to be a case where the Tanna Kama is going to rule against him. Now, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi are going to be joining Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, but the 3 of them agree it's not a vineyard. But the 3 of them are also agreeing that the novelty is you can't plant within the 4 amma. But each one of these 3 have different cases for how this Aris is being arranged. And that's going to be really the bulk of what the shir talks about. So the Mishnah starts and says that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that they all err who say so. And it says that if there's 4 amos from the base of the vines to the wall, we give it its work area, and he can plant the remainder. In other words, that you have to have your 4 amma setback no matter what, and the idea is it's not a vineyard, and then after that you can plant. Looks like a vineyard, but it's not. That's the novelty here. So the Gemara is going to comment on it, and Rabbi Yochanan says that Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yishmael, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, all 3 of them said the same thing. In other words, the 3 of these are holding that the novelty of the Aris is not that it's a vineyard, which means it needs a 4 amma work area. He's saying that it's going to have where any area less than 4 amos is going to be such that you can't put foreign seed there in the confined area. Now, in part 1 of this year, we were wondering about the Aris, that if it's not a vineyard and it's going to have, the status of being individual vines, you can make arrangements in a layout, whether it's going to be a zigzag or you're going to be planting, if they're arranged 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're going to be planting between the individual vines, is a little strip between, say, vine 1 and 2. And the idea is that, well, if this is a vineyard, then you can't plant within it. It doesn't have the status of being individual vines. And if it's not going to be a vineyard, then it is going to have the status of being individual vines. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying that, no, whether this is a vineyard or not, it doesn't matter. The novelty here is that there's always a 4 amma setback. And so that you can't do any of these arrangements like this game that we were talking about in part 1 of the shiur with a crooked Aris, where it's not a vineyard by Bet Shammai and it's not a vineyard by Bet Hillel, and that you could arrange a little planting strip between, say, 3 and 2 if this is a zigzag, and you could do your setbacks of 6 tefachim between each and do like a little tiny strip between, say, the first row and the second row, which is not aligned properly to be a vineyard, either by Bet Shammai or Bet Hillel. And the idea is that, no, wait a second, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that this is not a vineyard at all. And because it's not a vineyard, you can't do that. In other words, that you however you're going to arrange this, you're always having a 4 amma setback. And so, in fact, what we're going to be getting into later on is we're going to have a wall where the vines are going to be shaped like an L. And, well, that's not like, you have your 5 vines, right? But it's not in a row like Bet Shammai. And it's not 2, 2, and 1 with a tail where the 4 vines are mirroring each other, 2 and 2. That's like what Bet Hillel is saying. It's not like that. It's an L. You have 2 on the top and 3 on the bottom as an L, and you have 2 walls. And that's going to be the case that Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yishmael, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri are going to be talking about, so that by nobody, not by Bet Shammai or Bet Hillel, is that going to be a vineyard. And they're going to be saying that, no, the novelty here is that, well, it's not a vineyard, but you can't plant foreign seed. You can't treat this like being a set of individual vines to plant within it. That is going to be the novelty. It's not the halacha, by the way. So the Gemara is going to talk about the rulings made by these Tanaim to that effect. And the ruling of Rabbi Yishmael is that which we learned in the Mishnah. This, by the way, goes back to Idios in 2:4. And Rabbi Yishmael is testifying before the sages concerning, says this Gemara, a small garden that is surrounded by an Aris on all sides, and that if there is going to be in this garden sufficient space for the grape harvester and his basket here on this side of the garden, and enough space for the grape harvester and a basket there on the other side of the garden. In other words, you have the wall, the grapes are going up on the wall, and on the other side of the wall, there's going to be a garden. There's a setback between the wall and the garden, and it's basically saying that, look, if you can have 2 harvesters come and there's enough space to set a basket, and what's that going to be? Well, the person is going to basically need 1 amma to walk around, and he's going to need an amma to have the basket put down to gather grapes. And then you can see, well, wait a second, that's going to add up to 4 amma. Why? Because you're going to have 2 amma on this side of the wall and 2 amma on that side of the wall. So the idea is that, says this Mishnah, if there is in this garden enough space for a grape harvester and his basket here on this side of the garden, enough space for a grape harvester and his basket there on the other side of the garden, then if the garden is large enough to accommodate these 2 harvesters with their baskets picking grapes at the same time from this trained vine on the opposite sides of the garden, then it says, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, that the garden can be sown with a foreign seed. But if there is not that much space in the garden, it may not be sown with that much seed. Now, the idea is that it looks like Rabbi Yishmael's position is actually going to be paralleling Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's position. In other words, that he's also saying that this is not going to be like a vineyard, but the novelty is that there is still going to be 4 amos there. And really, that, if the space between the vines was 4 amos by 4 amos, then the entire area would fall within the 4 amma work area of the Aris vineyard that surrounds it, and you can't plant foreign seed there. So like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, he's holding that the novelty of an Aris is going to be that less than the 4 amma space is going to be deemed to be confined, says the Pnei Moshe, by the Aris, and prohibited for planting foreign seed. Now, this case and that case by Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is a little bit different. and one might agree with the other, but the other might not agree with the other. In other words, there's similarities, and in one way the two will agree, but in one way only one will agree. So what's going to be the difference? So in the case of the single wall Aris that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is talking about, only a less than 4 amma space inside the Aris itself, in other words, between the vines and the wall, is going to be deemed to be defined as the Aris. In other words, you have the vines, and the vines are going to be far from the wall, and you're going to be training over this wall, and the difference between the vines and the wall is going to be 4 amos. And the position of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is that under these vines, between the vine trunks and the wall, you can't plant in there. That's going to be the idea. So Rabbi Yishmael's case is going to be a little bit different. Rabbi Yishmael's case is going to be saying that if the garden is surrounded on all 4 sides by an Aris, even if it's going to be less than 4 amos space that is not inside the Aris, but between the sections of the Aris on one side of the garden and the other side of the garden, that's also going to be considered to be confined by the Aris, and that is going to be prohibited from planting foreign seed. Now, the differences here is going to be that when there's 4 amos in between the sections of the Aris on the opposite sides of the space is not considered confined by the Aris. So what's going to be the difference here? How could this possibly work? And the answer that's going to be coming up is that we're talking about vines in Rabbi Yishmael's ruling that are hugging along this wall. In other words, they're planted right next to this wall. And so what happens is, he's saying because this wall is so close to the vines and the vines are going up this wall, that if you're having 2 amos over here and 2 amos over there on this side of the wall and that side of the wall, that's your 4 amos. And now you can plant, say, 2 amos on that side of the wall, because again, it's not a vineyard. And you could plant 2 amos on the other side of the wall. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's case is a little bit different. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying that these vines are not hugging the wall, that there is a setback between the wall and the vine, and it has to be if the coverage of where the vines are hanging between the trunk of the vine to the fence is going to be 4 amos, then everything under there can't be planted. But let's say it's 6 amos. The novelty that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying is that within here, underneath this, the 4 amos that's hanging cannot be planted. That's always going to be the case. And then the 2 amos left over can be planted. In other words, everything that is going to be extra distance from the trunk of the vine to the wall that has this overhang, that can be planted, but everything less than that cannot be planted. That's the opinion. What's going to be the difference here and there? Both are talking about a difference with 4 amos. They both agree there's a 4 amos thing, but in Rabbi Yishmael's case, that this is growing up alongside of the fence and you're having 2 amos here, 2 amos there. So the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to define Rabbi Yishmael's measurement of the space for the grape harvester and the basket, and how is this going to work. And Rabbi Yonah explains it and says that an amma is allotted for the grape harvester to walk around in, and an amma for his basket to be put down at his side. And then on the other side of the fence, the amma is allotted for the grape harvester and an amma for his basket on the other side. In other words, that's going to add up for a total of 4 amos. That's how he's calculating it. So in other words, he's saying that if you're having 2 grape harvesters harvesting this wall, this Aris, at the same time, and you have one guy on one side of the fence, one guy on the other side of the fence, one guy with a basket and one guy with a basket, and they both can put down the basket at the same time, both are walking there at the same time, they're both having utility at the same time, and how much space they're taking up? 4 amos. Now, the Gemara is going to refine the nuance of Rabbi Yishmael's ruling, and the scholars of the Academy thought to say that according to the one who says that we measure the 4 amos from the base of the vines, that by the way is Bet Shammai, then Rabbi Yishmael's ruling is fine, and according to the one who says that we measure the 4 amos from the base of the wall, that by the way is Bet Hillel, then the question is, do not the vine trunks reduce the 4 amma garden space? In other words, if you have a setback and make it look more like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's Aris, where there's a big distance between the vines and the wall, well, how is this going to work exactly? So, because you're saying that on one side of the wall that there's going to be, two people picking at the same time on both sides, and one guy is going to be walking, and one guy is going to be walking, and they both can set down the basket. Well, and you're going to have, say, like a 4 amma setback between the vines and the wall. Then what do you do with this extra 2 amos? And that's not really going to be the case. Gemara is going to refine this and explain this nuance and answer that interpret Rabbi Yishmael's ruling as referring to where the vines are hugging the wall. In other words, that Rabbi Yishmael's ruling is only regarding a small garden spot or plot, and it is surrounded by a wall with an Aris. And now the Gemara is going to clarify a point on this ruling. So the Gemara is under this impression that each of the garden's wall has only one vine trellised on it. And so, because you could say, well, wait a second, if we have a very, very small Aris and a very, very small garden, perhaps, we have a box and it's a square. And perhaps in this square, there's only going to be, one vine on each 4 sides. But we know a vineyard is going to be 5 vines. And, individual vines are going to be, say, under 5 vines. So I was going to say, but is it not that 4 vines are nothing? In other words, it doesn't constitute an Aris because the law of the Aris applies only to 5 vines. So how does Rabbi Yishmael treat them as an Aris to require the 4 amma space in order to plant foreign seed? And the Gemara is going to answer this. In other words, Rabbi Hanania is going to say that interpret Rabbi Yishmael's ruling as referring to where there were 2 vines situated in one corner, so that if one were to stretch the perimeter of the square in a straight line, the vines would appear to have 4 amos between them. So how do you arrange this? How is this going to be exactly? Well, on one corner of this square, on one side of the corner and on the other side of the corner, there's going to be a single vine. So that one corner on just the area next to it has a vine, and the area next to that has a vine. So one corner basically is planted with 2 vines. That's going to be it, and so that's going to count up to 5 vines. In other words, we're not counting because there's 4 vines. We're counting one corner that doesn't have 4 vines. It has 5 vines because there's 2 planted there. That's the explanation. So the Gemara is going to identify the ruling made by Rabbi Yossi, which is going to demonstrate that he also agrees to the view that the novelty of the Aris is not that it is a vineyard, but rather that you have an area less than 4 amos that gets confined and prohibits the introduction of foreign seed in this confined area. Now, in the garden situation that we're talking about with Rabbi Yishmael, that is not shaped like Bet Hillel's set of vines, and it is not shaped like the set of vines that Bet Shammai was talking about. And in fact, Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel would say that that is not going to be a vineyard as they explain it. But the sages are going to be saying, well, perhaps that is perhaps that is going to be a vineyard. Certainly, I think that Rabbi Yishmael would agree that if you have 5 vines in a row, and then you have your wall there, and it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think Rabbi Yishmael would agree that that is going to be a vineyard. But Rabbi Yishmael is not talking about that point. He is talking about that there is going to be this less than 4 amma space where the vines are not arranged that way. Now, the Tanna Kama in this Mishnah are holding that the Aris is treated like a vineyard. It is a vineyard. It qualifies as a vineyard. And because of that, it has a 4 amma work area. Now, Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel are going to argue whether we consider the vineyard to be situated at the base of the vines and whether we're going to measure this from the base of the vines or from the wall. And, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, he's basically going to be saying that the novelty here is that everything less than 4 amma space is going to be deemed to be confined by the Aris, and you can't plant foreign seed within it. So the idea is that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's case of a single wall Aris, and the case over here is going to be that, well, Rabbi Yishmael is not talking about a single wall Aris like what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is talking about. Rabbi Yishmael is talking about a garden surrounded with 4 walls. That is going to be the nuance. Now, Rabbi Yossi has a different take on this. Rabbi Yossi is going to say like this in this Gemara. The ruling of Rabbi Yossi is that which we learned in the Mishnah, that Rabbi Yossi, by the way, in the Mishnah we're talking about in chapter 6, halacha 4 in Kilayim here. And Rabbi Yossi is going to say there in chapter 6, halacha 4, that if there are not 4 amos there, he may not introduce foreign seed there. What does that mean? The Mishnah is talking about a case where there are 2 walls that meet at a right angle, and this is where you're going to have that L shape. And this is now going to be, instead of 4 walls, like the case that we were talking about with Rabbi Yishmael, we're now talking about 2 walls. Rabbi Yossi's point is about 2 walls. And Rabbi Yossi is holding that if the space within the L of this Aris, because there's 2 walls, is not at least 4 amos by 4 amos, then planting foreign seed within that L is forbidden. Why? Because the space is considered confined by the Aris. In other words, what Rabbi Yishmael is holding for an area closed in by an Aris is going to be for 4 sides. And the Chazan Ish is explaining that Rabbi Yossi is maintaining that for an area to be closed in by an Aris is only going to be 2 sides. And if the space within the L of this Aris is 4 by 4, then planting foreign seed in that L is allowed as long as there's a distance of 6 tefachim from the vines. Now, Rabbi Yossi's position in some way is very similar to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's position in this Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's position is only talking about 1 wall. So the Gemara is going to continue and say that Rabbi Yossi there says that if there are not 4 amos there, he may not introduce foreign seed there. And, again, the question is, well, how far are your vines? How far are your vines going to be? Because, again, that's very much like what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is worried about. How far are your vines from this wall? And the Gemara says, according to the ones who say that we measure 4 amos from the base of the vines, that, by the way, is Bet Shammai, then Rabbi Yossi's ruling is just fine. In other words, according to that opinion, Rabbi Yossi's 4 amma measurement is from the base of the vines to the wall. And over here, Rabbi Yossi, where it's going to be like, according to the one who says that we measure from the base of the wall, 4 amos away from that, that's Bet Hillel, it's going to ask a question, do not these vine trunks reduce the 4 amma space? In other words, that the reason the 4 amma is necessary is going to be that there has to be space large enough to be considered an independent area. And if the area is really going to be an empty space smaller than this, it's going to be considered subordinate to the vines. And then the Gemara is going to be asking that since the vines themselves occupy the same 4 by 4 area formed by the L shape, then the area should be considered subordinate to the vines. And then, where's your 4 amos? How do you measure your 4 amos? So the Gemara is going to answer, and it's going to say, interpret Rabbi Yossi's ruling as referring to where the vines are hugging the wall. In other words, the reason that these vines are recessed into the wall is so that they don't reduce the 4 by 4 amma space at all. And the novelty that Rabbi Yossi has in understanding Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's position is that in discussing the L-shaped Aris, it emerges that the Aris vines are planted within 4 amos of each other, and then the L is going to be 4 amos long, and each arm is going to consist of 2 or 3 vines. So this would seem to run counter to what we were talking about, that the vines must be spaced at least 4 amos apart. And the idea is that Rabbi Yossi says that an Aris is not a vineyard. I don't need to space the vines separate from each other because it's not a vineyard. And in fact, when you look at Rabbi Yishmael's point about one corner of this enclosed 4 square box garden, where one corner is planted with 2 vines, he would say back that, well, an Aris is not a vineyard, so I don't need to separate between vine number 4 and vine number 5 because it's not a vineyard. I only need to separate that if it's a vineyard. And what they're both trying to use examples here, in the case of whether it's going to be an L shape or whether it's going to be a 4-box garden where there's 4 walls, is that in order to get your 5 vines here, because you have to have 5 vines, and Aris is qualified by 5 vines, is they're saying it's not a vineyard. But these cases do show that because it's not a vineyard, there's no setback between individual vines having to be 4 amos from one another, like what we learned for a normal vineyard. And because of that, Well, we can have the vines, in fact, being planted right next to each other because, again, these are not a vineyard. But now it has 5 vines, and now it qualifies for this Aris novelty, which is that you can't plant within the 4 amos. Where are you going to measure the 4 amos from? That's another question. But the Gemara is going to say, interpret Rabbi Yossi's ruling as talking about where these vines are actually hugging on to the wall. Now, we're going to sum this up with the 3 positions. 3 positions is 1 wall, 2 walls, and 4 walls. Now, the Gemara identifies the ruling made by Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri as talking about where he says that the novelty of the Aris is not that it's a vineyard, and Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yossi agree with that. That's not the halacha. Tanna Kama disagree with it. But that it's confining the area of less than 4 amos to prohibit the introduction of foreign seed in that confined area. In other words, the Gemara says, and so to here, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in this Mishnah is going to hold this way. In other words, he's going to be saying that the Mishnah states explicitly that the Aris novelty is not that the Aris constitutes a vineyard, but that it confines the area of less than 4 amos to prohibit the introduction of foreign seed in that space. And again, as you see from the later positions of Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Yossi, who are saying that, well, you can make an L, and you can have 2 walls, or you can make a box, you can have 4 walls. And by the way, within this, you still have 5 vines. These are not treated like Bet Shammai's vineyard 5 in a row, or Bet Hillel's 2, 2, and 1, where it has a tail. But really, you're actually, because it's not a vineyard, you're planting these, 2 of these vines right next to each other, either to make the L or to make this box and get to 5. So the Gemara observes that while Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yishmael, and Rabbi Yochanan all have the same view, that the novelty of the Aris is going to be that it is going to confine an area of less than 4 amos, so that you always have this 4 amos setback, and you can't plant foreign seed within it. By the way, where's this 4 amos going to be? Rabbi Yishmael is going to be saying that it's going to be 2 on this side of the wall, 2 on that side of the wall. Anyway, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is going to be saying that the novelty of it is going to be for how do you measure this? Well, he's going to be saying that you have your vines separated from the wall by 4 amos, and it's hanging underneath. And underneath this 4 amos, you can't plant within it. And Rabbi Yossi is basically saying that the vines that you have here are on the same side, and that he's basically saying that you have to calculate what is within the L. You have to set back from within the L. So the Gemara is going to say that it is reasonable to assume that Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yishmael are going to concede to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri that a less than 4 amos space between the vines and the wall of the Aris is not deemed confined by the Aris. In other words, he's saying that if you have the vines set back way far away and you're hanging over there, this Gemara is saying that Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yossi would agree with that position. Now, the Gemara says, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is not going to agree with the position of Rabbi Yossi with his L, or with Rabbi Yishmael with his box. And the Gemara says, likewise, it is reasonable to assume that Rabbi Yossi with his L is going to concede to Rabbi Yishmael, but Rabbi Yishmael with his box is not going to concede to Rabbi Yossi. In other words, Rabbi Yishmael's less than 4 amma wide garden that is surrounded by an Aris on all 4 sides is certainly considered more confined by the Aris than Rabbi Yossi's L. And, where he's saying that that the space is going to be confined on only 2 sides instead of 4 sides. And Rabbi Yossi is going to be considered that even the latter to be confined by the Aris. In other words, he's going to be saying that certainly Rabbi Yishmael's 4-wall box is confined. But Rabbi Yishmael is not necessarily going to be saying that the 2-wall Aris is confined. And that is going to be where one agrees with one but doesn't agree with the other. So the halacha is not going to be like either of these 3. The halacha is going to be that the Aris actually is a vineyard. Now the Ravad says that the novelty of the Aris is that it is a vineyard d'Rabbanan and not d'Oraita. And the Ravad's point is that there is something special about this, and for some reason, if you're going to read it like the Ravad, which is going to be that they gave it a d'Rabbanan fence. Why a fence? No pun intended. Because they are trying to reinforce it, maybe because of a Mars Ein, which is that the Aris, the novelty of the Aris is that this is a vineyard d'Rabbanan, not d'Oraita. The idea is going to be that, well, wait a second, maybe what Bet Hillel is saying is that this is not a d'Oraita vineyard, and that while it would look like the setbacks should be 6 tefachim and treated like individual vines, they're saying that if you're going to read it like how the Ravad proposes, that this is a vineyard d'Rabbanan, and that really the novelty here is that you can't plant within 4 amos because they are treating it that way. Now, the other 3 Tanaim are saying that it's not a vineyard. And, well, maybe they're saying it's not a vineyard because they're talking about a d'Oraita vineyard. And certainly they're going to now say that, but the novelty here is that the sages put a 4 amma setback. So this might be a worry that they have about a halacha l'moshe l'sinai going back to Maris Ein issues, and not that this is going to be a d'Oraita fence that they're putting up, so to speak, fence, but that there's a Maris Ein worry that people are going to worry that this is like a vineyard. Why? Because maybe the wall is 10 tefachim and might look like 8 tefachim high, and an 8 tefach wall is going to have the characteristics of being a vineyard. Maybe people aren't going to be able to tell the difference between trellises that are lower or higher, and maybe they're just putting it in so that when you have a d'Oraita vineyard, that they're always going to have a separation of 4 amos that is going to be there, and that this is going to be a fence that's put up because, again, that Kilayim is a d'Oraita issue. You can't plant within 4 amos of a vineyard, and maybe they're putting up this fence because maybe some of these guys would have a fence that's smaller than that, and people might actually be accidentally planting something on a trellis that's going to be shorter than 10 tefachim, and then they're going to be in violation d'Oraita and have to tear up their stuff, and it's going to be a problem. Now, the Mishnah is going to finish off, and we have this where Rabbi Akiva says in the Mishnah, 3 tefachim in every direction of a single vine is prohibited for planting, and the rabbis say 6 tefachim. And you say, wait a second, what? We've been learning this whole time, 6 tefachim. What's going on over here? Well, they're going to explain it. So, Rav Yudah says in the name of Rav, the halacha goes with Rabbi Akiva. But the Gemara is going to explain what this is and why this is. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi says in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, the halacha outside of the land of Israel is according with the opinion of one who is lenient. In other words, that Rav agrees that the halacha accords with the Tana Kama, that the prohibited area for a single vine is 6 tefachim, but he's ruling in accordance with Rabbi Akiva in Bavel. And here, this is where Rav is living. And there's a general rule with respect to disputes regarding land-dependent mitzvos and things under biblical law that are only in Eretz Yisrael. The idea is that a lot of these laws are going to be lenient outside of Eretz Yisrael, even if it's only a minority opinion. And the Gemara is going to corroborate that Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha says that, and it was taught there in Bavel, the halacha outside of the land of Israel accords with the opinion of one who is lenient. In other words, that, the idea is that we're looking at what's in the land and what is out of the land, and the idea is that they're treating this for the setbacks for the vineyard as being a law in the land, and that within the land you're supposed to have 6 tefachim for an individual vine, but outside of the land, like in Bavel, it is only a 3 tefach setback. And the idea that Rav Huna is going to be stating earlier in chapter 4 is that the halacha, even outside of Eretz Yisrael, accords to Rabbi Yishmael, who is even more lenient than Rabbi Akiva, and is going to be holding that there's no work area whatsoever for a single vine. So the question is, well, wait a second. Is it going to be 3 tefachim, or is it going to be no tefachim? Because that's the most lenient position. And the other Rishonim are not distinguishing between the law for inside of the land and outside of the land, but the Gemara here in the Yerushalmi does, and it often comes up that, like in a Masechet Avodah Zarah, that it's talking about what is the law for inside of the land and outside of the land in chapter 1. That comes up many times. So In Halacha 2, we're going to be getting into what happens when the Aris is planted in an elevated space. Where are you going to put your 4 tefachim setback? Have a great day.